Ambient sound, dripping water, the low hum of still underground air, the crunch of gravel under boots. A headlamp beam sweeps across wet limestone. Breathing is audible, slightly elevated. You're 800 feet underground. The passage has narrowed to the point where your shoulders brush both walls when you turn. Your headlamp catches maybe 15 feet of rock ahead of you before the dark simply swallows the beam hole. Behind you, the lights of your team are gone. Not because they left. Because the tunnel curved, and down here, a single curve in the rock erases everything. Light, sound, direction. You stop walking, you stop breathing, because something ahead of you in a passage that has been sealed and unmapped since 1971 just knocked, twice. Not a settling sound, not water dripping onto a hollow formation. Two distinct, deliberate, evenly spaced knocks, like knuckles on a wooden door. And then nothing. You stand there in the silence that only exists underground, a silence so total it feels like pressure against your eardrums, and you wait. You wait for an explanation, a rock shift, a pop from thermal change, anything that gives you permission to keep walking, but the explanation doesn't come. Instead, what comes is a third knock, closer, beat of silence. Then the low, steady tone of the documentary score begins. The following account is based on incident reports, audio logs, and a series of interviews conducted with members of a geological survey team who entered an abandoned silver mine in White Pine County, Nevada, in September of 2019. What they experienced over the course of 31 hours underground has never been fully explained. This is Dale Morrow's final report. Part 2. The witness. My name is Dale Raymond Morrow. I'm 52 years old. I've spent 28 of those years working underground, hard rock mines mostly, in Nevada, Colorado, and northern Mexico. Copper, silver, a few gold operations. I started as a mucker at 19, shoveling ore into carts at a small operation outside of Elko, and I worked my way into ventilation and atmospheric safety, which is where I've been for the last 16 years. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand something before I say another word. I'm not a man who gets nervous underground. The underground is where I've spent my adult life. I understand rock. I understand pressure. I understand how air moves through a confined space, how sound behaves when it bounces off wet limestone versus dry granite, how temperature gradients create drafts that can sound, to someone unfamiliar, like breathing. I know what a mine sounds like when it's settling. I know what it sounds like when it's about to fail. I have pulled men out of collapses. I have performed rescues in passages so tight I had to exhale fully just to push forward. I have never, not once, filed a report I couldn't stand behind. What I'm about to tell you is what happened. I don't have an explanation for it. I've been asked for one. I've been asked to speculate. I've been asked to attribute it to gas exposure, fatigue, instrument malfunction, group psychology. I understand why those explanations are attractive. I've tried to believe them myself. I can't. Not because I'm certain something was down there with us, but because every explanation I've been offered requires me to disbelieve things I heard with my own ears, saw with my own eyes, and recorded on equipment that was functioning within normal parameters. I don't go underground anymore. I want to make that clear at the outset. Not because I was fired, not because I was injured. I stopped because of what happened in that mine, and because of what I believe, what I'm afraid, came out with us. Part 3. The job. In August of 2019, I was contacted by a geological consulting firm called Ridgeline Associates out of Reno. They had been contracted by a mining company, I'm not going to name them, to conduct a preliminary resurvey of an inactive silver mine in the Shell Creek Range, White Pine County, eastern Nevada. The mine had originally been worked from the 1880s through about 1953, then briefly reopened for exploratory drilling in 1969 through 1971 before being sealed again. The company wanted to know if modern extraction methods made it worth reopening. My role was atmospheric safety. Before any survey team goes into a mine that's been sealed for decades, someone like me goes in first, or alongside, to monitor air quality in real time. Oxygen levels, carbon dioxide concentration, hydrogen sulfide, methane if applicable, radon in some formations. I carry portable gas detectors, thermal sensors, and a handheld anemometer for airflow measurement. This is not optional. This is how people stay alive underground. The survey team was 5 people total. Rick Padilla was team lead, experienced mining surveyor, maybe mid-40s, very calm, very methodical. I'd worked with Rick once before on a job in Nye County and trusted him completely. Ellen Cho was the geologist, brought in to assess the ore body and structural stability. She was sharp, published, had spent time in research caves in Kentucky and New Mexico. Marcus Webb was a junior surveyor, maybe 26, relatively green but competent. And Tommy Garza handled equipment, the laser scanning rig, the communications relay, the generator for our base camp lighting just inside the main adit. The 5 of us drove out to the site on September 9th. The mine entrance, the main adit, was at about 7,000 feet elevation, cut into a steep hillside covered in juniper and sage. The original timber framing around the entrance had been replaced with a steel bulkhead and concrete collar when they sealed it in '71, and the company had sent a crew out a week earlier to unbolt the door and install temporary ventilation ducting for the first 100 meters. The first thing I noticed, and I noted this in my log, was the air coming out of that adit. When you unseal a mine that's been closed for nearly 50 years, you expect the air to be stale, dead. Low oxygen, elevated CO2, possibly toxic accumulations depending on the geology. But the air coming out of this mine was moving. There was a draft, not strong but steady, which meant there was another opening somewhere, a vent shaft, a collapsed section open to the surface, something allowing air to circulate. That's not unusual, but I couldn't find it on any of the original mine maps. There was no secondary opening documented, which meant either the maps were incomplete, very possible for a mine first worked in the 1880s, or the opening had been created by natural collapse sometime in the last 50 years. Either way, the air tested within acceptable parameters. Oxygen was slightly low, 19.8% versus the normal 20.9%, but within safe limits. CO2 was elevated but manageable. No hydrogen sulfide. No methane. The temperature inside the adit was a constant 51 degrees Fahrenheit. We entered at 6:40 a.m. on September 10th. The plan was a 2-day survey, sleep underground at a base camp we'd established just inside the main adit, work deeper into the mine on day 1, complete the survey on day 2, and exit by the evening of the 11th. That was the plan. Part 4. What the underground KEPS, the narrator's voice shifts, slightly more measured, documentary style. Before we continue with Dale's account, it's worth understanding something about the relationship between human beings and the underground. It is one of the oldest relationships in our history, and one of the most uneasy. We have been going underground for tens of thousands of years. The painted caves of Lascaux and Altamira, some dating back over 30,000 years, show that our ancestors were willing to crawl deep into absolute darkness, far beyond the reach of daylight, to leave marks on stone walls that no living person was meant to casually see. Some researchers have suggested that the act of going underground was itself a ritual, a crossing into another world. The caves were not shelters. They were something else. In the Yucatan Peninsula, archaeologists have discovered ancient mining operations inside flooded cave systems, places where Mayan and pre-Mayan peoples extracted ochre and mineral pigments from submerged passages, diving into lightless underground rivers to reach deposits that could have been obtained far more easily on the surface. Why they chose to mine in these specific, extraordinarily dangerous locations remains a matter of debate. Some scholars believe the material extracted from underground was considered spiritually different from surface material, that the underground origin itself was what gave it power. And in virtually every culture that has a history of mining, there are stories about things that live below. The Cornish miners who came to work the tin and copper mines of England's West Country brought with them the legend of the knockers, small, unseen beings who inhabited the deep shafts and tunnels. Knockers would tap on the walls, sometimes to warn of collapse, sometimes to lead miners toward rich ore veins, and sometimes, if disrespected, to lead them astray. Miners would leave small offerings of food at the edges of their work areas. They would not whistle underground. They would not speak ill of the knockers. These were not children's stories. These were operational protocols, followed by grown men whose lives depended on the stability of the ground above their heads. When Cornish miners emigrated to the American West during the gold and silver rushes of the 1800s, they brought the knockers with them. Reports of underground knocking, rhythmic, deliberate, sourceless, appear in mining records from California, Nevada, Colorado, and Montana throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. In some accounts, the knocking preceded cave-ins, and miners who heeded the warning survived. In others, the knocking led men deeper into unmapped passages from which they did not return. Similar traditions exist in the mining cultures of Wales, Germany, Scandinavia, and Bolivia. The names change at Cobalt's, Tommyknockers, the Tio of the Bolivian tin mines, but the core elements remain remarkably consistent. An unseen intelligence deep underground that communicates through sound, through knocking, through the walls. Part 5. The first anomaly. Dale Morrow's voice resumes. The first 4 hours were routine. We moved through the main adit, a roughly 6 by 7 foot tunnel running east into the hillside, for about 300 meters before hitting the first junction. The mine opened up into a wider chamber where the original operation had followed a vein of silver bearing ore downward at about a 15-degree angle. From there, the tunnels branched, a series of lateral drifts at various levels connected by inclined passages, and in 2 places, vertical shafts fitted with rusted ladder cages. Rick was mapping as we went, cross-referencing with the 1971 survey data. Ellen was taking rock samples and making notes on structural integrity. Marcus ran the laser scanner. Tommy managed the cable for our communication relay back to base camp. I monitored air. Everything was normal until we reached the 3rd level, roughly 240 meters below the surface entrance, maybe 800 feet of total depth when you accounted for the hill's elevation. The 3rd level was where the 1971 team had stopped. Their last survey marker, a brass pin drilled into the wall with a numbered tag, was right at the junction where the drift continued east and an unmapped passage branched off to the south. The 1971 records noted the southern passage but described it simply as unexplored, unstable. No further detail. We were standing at that junction, all 5 of us, when I first noticed the anomaly. My anemometer, the device I used to measure air movement, registered a change. Up to that point, the airflow had been consistent, a gentle draft moving from the deeper parts of the mine toward the entrance, which was expected if there was a secondary opening providing circulation. But at that junction, the air shifted. The draft reversed. It was now pulling air from the main drift into the southern passage. That meant the secondary opening, wherever it was connected to that unmapped southern passage. I told Rick. He noted it. Ellen wanted to investigate. A previously unexplored passage was exactly the kind of thing that could reveal untouched ore deposits. Rick agreed to a short reconnaissance, maybe 50 meters into the southern drift, with full atmospheric monitoring. We entered the southern passage at 11:15 a.m. The passage was narrower than the main drift, maybe 4.5 feet wide, a little over 6 feet tall. The walls were natural limestone with minimal tool marks, which suggested the original miners had followed a natural fissure rather than blasting. The floor was uneven, covered in a thin layer of calcium deposits and in places shallow standing water. About 30 meters in, I heard it, a sound. Low, not a knock, not yet, more like a hum, a vibration that I felt in my chest before I consciously heard it with my ears. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, then stopped. I asked if anyone else had heard it. Rick said no. Ellen said she felt something but attributed it to a pressure change. Marcus and Tommy hadn't noticed anything. I checked my instruments. Oxygen was 19.5%, slightly lower but still within the safe range. CO2 was elevated at 0.8%, notable but not dangerous, not enough to cause auditory hallucination. I noted the sound in my log and we continued. 40 meters in, the passage curved to the right and began to descend more steeply. The walls became wetter. The air was noticeably cooler. I measured it at 46 degrees, a 5-degree drop from the main drift. And then I heard the knocking. Part 6. Things that knock back. Documentary narrator. In 1925, a cave explorer named Floyd Collins became trapped in Sand Cave, near Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, while attempting to find a new entrance to the vast cave system beneath Flint Ridge. Collins had squeezed through a narrow crawlway when a 27-pound rock shifted and pinned his left leg. He was stuck, wedged into a passage barely wider than his body, roughly 55 feet below the surface. For the next 2 weeks, rescue efforts consumed the nation's attention. Reporters crawled into the cave to interview Collins. Food and water were passed down through the narrow passage. Attempts to widen the crawlway caused partial collapses that eventually cut off direct access entirely. Floyd Collins died underground on approximately February 13, 1925, likely of exposure, dehydration, and exhaustion. His body was not recovered for months. But what is less frequently discussed are the reports from the rescuers, the men who spent hours and days in the passages around Collins. Several described hearing sounds that they could not explain, knocking from within the rock, sounds of movement in passages that were known to be empty, and in one account, what sounded like distant conversation in a language no one could identify. These reports were largely dismissed at the time, attributed to exhaustion, stress, and the disorienting acoustics of the cave environment. And that dismissal is not unreasonable. Cave acoustics are genuinely strange. Sound underground does not behave the way it does on the surface. Passages act as waveguides, channeling and amplifying sounds over distances that seem impossible. A drip of water half a mile away can sound like it's next to your ear. A voice can be carried around corners and through fissures, arriving as an unrecognizable murmur. The human brain, deprived of visual reference points and immersed in silence, will attempt to impose patterns on any available auditory input. It will hear whispers in white noise. It will hear knocking in random geological settling. This is well documented. It is real. It is science. But it does not explain everything. In 2014, a cave exploration team in Mammoth Cave, the longest known cave system in the world, with over 400 mapped miles of passages, reported a series of encounters that were formally noted in their expedition log. Over the course of 3 days underground, multiple team members independently reported hearing rhythmic knocking from behind sealed passages, sounds of footsteps in areas that had been confirmed empty minutes before, and most disturbingly, the sensation of being watched from passages that their instruments showed contained no living thing. The team completed their survey without injury, but 2 members declined to participate in subsequent expeditions. Their reports remain in the expedition archive, unexplained. The Mammoth Cave system sits beneath the rolling limestone karst of central Kentucky. It is ancient. Some passages are over 10 million years old. Within those passages, in the perpetual dark, there are ecosystems that have evolved entirely without light. Eyeless fish, translucent crayfish, beetles that navigate by sensing air currents. Life, adapting to the absence of everything we associate with the living world. And those are just the things we've found. Part 7, Escalation. Dale Morrow. The knocking came from ahead of us, from deeper in the southern passage. 2 knocks, then a pause, then 2 more, even spacing, consistent rhythm. This time everyone heard it. Rick raised his hand, the signal to stop and hold position. We all stood still. No one spoke. The only sounds were our breathing and the faint drip of water from the ceiling. 10 seconds of silence, then 2 more knocks, same rhythm. But the direction was wrong. They were coming from behind us now, from the passage we had just walked through. Ellen said it was an echo, sound bouncing off the curve in the passage, arriving delayed. It was a reasonable explanation and I wanted to believe it, but I've spent nearly 3 decades listening to echoes underground. Echoes decay. They lose energy. They lose definition. These knocks were clean, sharp. They sounded closer, not farther. And the timing was wrong. The interval between the original sound and the echo was too long for the distance involved. For the geometry of that passage, a reflected sound should have arrived in a fraction of a second. This was a full 2-second delay, as if something had heard the knocking and was answering it. Rick made the call to pull back to the junction and regroup. No argument from anyone. We turned around and started back. That's when Tommy's radio died. We were using a hardwired communication relay, a field telephone system with physical cable running back to base camp. It's old technology, but it's reliable. Radio waves don't penetrate rock well, so most serious underground operations use wired communication. Tommy had been paying out the cable as we moved. He tested the line. Dead. No static, no signal, just silence. He checked the cable. It was intact, uncut, undamaged, still connected to the spool, but the line was dead. As though whatever was on the other end had simply ceased to exist. I want to be clear about something. Equipment fails underground. It's not uncommon. Moisture, temperature fluctuations, physical damage from being dragged through narrow passages. There are a dozen mundane reasons a comm line can go dead. I have experienced equipment failure many times in my career. It is annoying. It is not by itself frightening, but the timing. The timing made it something else. We reached the junction and stopped. Rick tried the comm line again from a different handset. Nothing. He made the decision to send Tommy back to base camp to check the relay unit and re-establish communication while the rest of us waited at the junction. Tommy didn't want to go alone. I could see it in his face. He didn't say it. Tommy was professional, not the kind to voice that sort of thing, but he hesitated. Just for a second. Then he picked up his gear and started back up the main drift toward base camp. We watched his headlamp shrink down the tunnel until the passage curved and the light disappeared. The four of us waited at the junction. I monitored the air. Oxygen had dropped to 19.2% low, but still within the acceptable range. CO2 had risen to 1.1%. I noted it, flagged it. At concentrations above 1.5%, CO2 can cause headache, dizziness, and mild confusion. We weren't there yet, but the trend was moving in the wrong direction. Rick asked me if the CO2 levels could explain the knocking. I told him the truth. At these concentrations, no. CO2-related hallucination typically requires levels above 5%, and at that point you're dealing with acute toxicity. You're not hearing phantom knocks, you're losing consciousness. What we were experiencing was within the range of normal variation for a deep, poorly ventilated mine. We waited 12 minutes. Then Ellen said, "Do you hear that?" I did. It was different from the knocking. It was a sound like, and I've struggled with this description because nothing quite captures it, like fabric being dragged across stone. A soft, continuous sliding sound, coming from the southern passage, the passage we had just left, and it was getting closer. Part 8, The Deep Places documentary narrator. In 2014, a hiker and adventurer named Kenny Veach posted a video to YouTube describing an unusual experience he'd had while hiking alone near Nellis Air Force Base in the Nevada desert. He described finding a cave entrance shaped, he said, like a perfect M set into a hillside. As he approached the entrance, he said his entire body began to vibrate. Not metaphorically. He described an intense physical vibration that increased as he got closer to the opening. He turned back without entering. Veach later announced his intention to return to the cave and locate it again. In November of 2014, he went hiking in the same area. He never came back. His cell phone was later found near an abandoned mine shaft. No other trace of Kenny Veach has ever been recovered. His disappearance has never been solved. The vibration Veach described is consistent with a phenomenon known as infrasound, sound waves at frequencies below the threshold of human hearing, typically below 20 Hz. Infrasound cannot be consciously heard, but it can be felt. It resonates in the chest cavity, the abdomen, the skull. At certain frequencies, particularly around 18 to 19 Hz, infrasound has been documented to cause feelings of unease, anxiety, and dread. It can cause visual disturbances, including the sensation of movement at the periphery of vision. In some cases, it can cause difficulty breathing and a sense of oppressive weight on the chest. Infrasound occurs naturally in caves and mines. Wind moving across an opening at the right angle, water flowing through subterranean channels, even seismic micro-vibrations transmitted through bedrock. A cave, by its geometry, can act as a resonance chamber, amplifying these sub-audible frequencies to intensities that produce profound physiological and psychological effects in anyone inside. This is measurable. This is physics. But physics does not explain everything that has been reported from the deep places. The Nahanni Valley in Canada's Northwest Territories, sometimes called the Valley of Headless Men, sits above a vast and largely unexplored network of limestone caves and underground rivers. Since the early 1900s, the valley has been associated with disappearances, unexplained deaths, and reports of strange sounds emanating from the cave systems that riddle the surrounding mountains. Indigenous oral traditions describe the valley as a dwelling place for beings that live inside the earth, not metaphorically, but literally. Beings that are heard but not seen, that announce their presence through sound, through vibration, through the feeling of being watched from the dark. Between 1908 and 1971, at least a dozen people vanished in the Nahanni Valley or were found dead under circumstances that were never fully explained. Several of the bodies were found without their heads. No definitive cause was ever established. The caves beneath the Nahanni Valley have never been fully mapped. Part 9. Contact Dale Morrow. The sliding sound stopped, and in the silence that followed I became aware of something I couldn't quantify, and this is the part of my account that I know will be hardest to take seriously. There was a presence. In the southern passage, something was there in the dark just beyond the reach of our lights. I'm not a superstitious man. I don't believe in ghosts. I have spent my career in places where darkness is absolute and silence is total, and I have never, before that day, had the feeling that I was not alone when my instruments told me I was. But standing at that junction in that mine, I felt it with a certainty that I cannot rationalize away. Something was there, and it was aware of us. Rick felt it too. I know because he reached over and put his hand on my arm, not a gesture of fear, but a signal. He felt it. He looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us said a word. Ellen had her headlamp pointed into the southern passage. The beam reached maybe 40 feet before the passage curved. There was nothing visible, no movement, no shape, just wet rock and darkness, but the air had changed. My anemometer confirmed it. The draft that had been pulling into the southern passage had stopped. The air was completely still. In a cave system with a secondary opening providing circulation, the air does not simply stop moving. Something was blocking the airflow. Something in that passage between us and whatever vent or opening lay deeper in the system was large enough to obstruct the draft. Or the opening had sealed itself, which was geologically impossible on that timescale. I told Rick about the airflow. He nodded. He said very quietly, "We're leaving." We started back up the main drift toward base camp. Not running, you don't run underground. You move carefully, deliberately. Running in a mine is how you fall down shafts, trip over debris, knock loose unstable rock. But we were moving fast, faster than the careful survey pace we'd maintained on the way in. We had gone maybe 100 meters when we heard it again. The knocking. But this time it was different. It wasn't coming from behind us. It wasn't coming from ahead of us. It was coming from inside the walls, both walls, left and right. A rapid series of knocks, not the slow, measured rhythm from before, but fast, urgent, almost frantic. Like something on the other side of the rock was trying to get through, or trying to keep pace with us as we moved. Ellen stopped. She put her hand on the left wall. "I can feel it," she said. "The rock is vibrating." I checked my instruments. Oxygen, 19%. CO2, 1.3%, both trending in the wrong direction. Temperature had dropped another 2 degrees. And then, and this is in my equipment log, timestamped, recorded, my atmospheric sensor registered a sudden spike in air pressure. A pulse, like something large had exhaled in a confined space. Marcus said, "What is that?" And then the lights went out. Part 10, Darkness. Dale Morrow continued. His voice is noticeably slower, more measured, as though choosing each word carefully. "I need to explain what darkness means underground. On the surface, there is no true darkness. Even on the blackest night in the most remote location, there is ambient light, starlight, atmospheric scatter, bioluminescence. Your eyes adjust. You can eventually see shapes, outlines, the difference between ground and sky. Underground, there is none of that. When your light goes out in a cave, the darkness is absolute, total. It is the darkness that existed before there were eyes to see. It has physical weight. It presses against you. Your brain, an organ that has evolved over millions of years to process visual information, suddenly has nothing to process. It begins to fill the void. You see shapes, movement, colors, not because they are there, but because your brain cannot accept the absence of input. It would rather hallucinate than experience nothing. This is documented. This is known. And I tell you this because I want you to understand that I am aware of it. I know that a human mind in total darkness is unreliable. I know that what I experienced in those next minutes may have been partially or wholly a product of my brain's inability to cope with the absence of light. I know that. And I still cannot explain what happened. All four of our headlamps went out simultaneously. Not one by one, simultaneously. These are professional-grade mining headlamps with independent battery packs, LED arrays, and backup incandescent bulbs. The odds of all four failing at the same moment are, for practical purposes, 0. The only scenario I can construct that accounts for simultaneous failure is a massive electromagnetic pulse, which does not occur naturally in a limestone mine. The darkness was immediate and total. I heard Ellen make a small sound, not a scream, just a sharp intake of breath. Marcus swore. Rick said, "Nobody move, stay where you are, check your backups." I reached for my backup light, a handheld flashlight clipped to my belt. Before I could turn it on, I heard something that I will never be able to explain or forget. A voice. Not a word, not language exactly, but a vocalization, a sound produced by something with lungs and a throat and a mouth. A low, breathy exhalation that carried with it something that sounded like syllables, like speech, but not in any language I have ever heard, not in any pattern that matched human speech cadence. It came from directly in front of me, maybe 10 feet away. In a passage where seconds earlier my headlamp had shown nothing but empty tunnel, I turned on my flashlight. The passage was empty, but the air in front of me was different. I could see it, or rather, I could see the effect of it. The beam of my flashlight, which should have been a clean, solid cone of light, was distorted. It wavered, like looking through heat haze on a highway in summer. Something was affecting the air density in a localized area directly ahead of me. Not uniformly, in a column. A roughly vertical distortion, maybe 6 feet tall. It lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3. Then it was gone, and the beam of my flashlight was clean and normal, cutting through the dark and hitting the far wall of the drift. Rick got his backup light on. Then Ellen, then Marcus. We stood there, 4 lights pointed forward, breathing hard, staring at an empty tunnel. "Go," Rick said. "Now, Part 11, Ascent Dale Morrow." We moved, fast. Not running, but the closest thing to it that you can do in a mine without killing yourself. Rick was in front, I was second, Ellen third, Marcus at the rear. I kept my flashlight pointed forward and my atmospheric sensor in my left hand. The readings were getting worse. Oxygen, 18.6%. CO2, 1.7%. We were entering the range where CO2 starts to affect cognition, headache, confusion, impaired judgment. Whether what we had experienced was influenced by the deteriorating air quality, I honestly do not know, but I noted it. I noted it because I'm a professional, and even in that moment some part of me was still doing my job. Behind us, and all 3 of them confirmed this afterward, independently, we could hear movement. Not knocking, not sliding, footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps. The sound of something walking on wet stone, maintaining a consistent distance behind us. Never closer. Never farther, pacing us. Marcus kept turning around. He'd swing his light behind us and the passage would be empty. Nothing. Wet rock, darkness beyond the beam. He'd turn forward again, and within seconds the footsteps would resume. I have thought about this. I have spent the last 4 years thinking about this. The rational explanation is echo, our own footsteps reflecting back from the passage behind us with a delay caused by the geometry of the tunnel. I have tested this theory. I went to a similar mine. I didn't go deep, just far enough to test the acoustics, and I walked through a passage of comparable dimensions. My footsteps echoed. They echoed correctly. They decayed with distance. They did not sound like a separate set of footsteps maintaining pace from a fixed distance behind me. What we heard was not an echo. We reached the junction with the upper levels and started climbing. The inclined passage that connected the third level to the second was steep, maybe 30 degrees, with old timber steps that were partially rotted. We went up one at a time, testing each step. The footsteps behind us stopped when we started climbing. I don't know why, but they stopped. We reached the second level and the air immediately improved. Oxygen climbed to 19.5. CO2 dropped. I could feel it, my head cleared, the tightness in my chest eased. Whatever atmospheric anomaly had been building on the third level did not extend to the upper workings. We found Tommy at base camp. He was sitting on a supply crate with his headlamp on, staring at the comm equipment. "It's working," he said. "It was working the whole time. I tested it from both ends. There's nothing wrong with it." He had been calling us on the field telephone for the last 20 minutes, getting no response. But the line was live. The equipment was functioning. The cable was intact. We had simply not received any signal. Rick told Tommy we were leaving, all of us. Now, Tommy didn't argue. He'd been alone at base camp for nearly 40 minutes, and he said something that I didn't fully process until later. He said, "Something came up from the shaft while you were gone." When Rick asked him what he meant, Tommy said he'd heard sounds coming from the shaft that led down to the lower levels, the shaft we had descended 3 hours earlier. Not knocking. Not footsteps. He described it as a sound like something large, slowly, very slowly ascending the shaft, a scraping, a shifting of weight against rock, continuous and steady like something climbing. He said it stopped about 10 minutes before we arrived. Part 12. Things that follow. Documentary narrator. There is a concept in underground folklore that rarely makes it into the official accounts, but persists in the oral traditions of miners and cavers across cultures. The idea that certain things, once disturbed, do not remain underground. In Cornish mining tradition, the knockers were generally bound to the mines they inhabited. But there were exceptions, stories of miners who violated taboos or penetrated sealed chambers who would afterward hear knocking in their homes, in their walls, under their floors. The sound would come at night, always in the same rhythm they'd heard underground, and it would continue until some form of appeasement was made, or until it stopped on its own, for reasons that were never clear. In the coal mining communities of Appalachia, similar stories circulated well into the 20th century. Miners returning from shifts in deep operations would report hearing sounds in the walls of their houses, tapping, scratching, the low hum of vibration. Their families would hear it too. The phenomena would typically last for a few days or weeks, then cease. In some accounts, it never stopped. These stories are anecdotal, they are folklore, they are not evidence of anything, but they are remarkably consistent across cultures, across centuries, across continents, and they share a common feature that is difficult to attribute to coincidence or cultural cross-contamination: the idea that the underground is not merely a place, it is a boundary. And some boundaries, once crossed, are not easily re-established. Part 13. Exit Dale Morrow. We packed up base camp in under 15 minutes. Normally, a breakdown like that takes an hour. You're coiling cable, packing instruments, cataloging samples. We left things behind. Ellen's rock samples from the third level, Marcus's scanner data, Tommy's cable spool. We took our personal gear, our safety equipment, and we left. The walkout was 300 meters, the main adit. Straight, wide enough for 2 abreast, with the original timber shoring replaced by steel sets in the 1970s. This was the safest part of the mine. We had walked it twice already. There was nothing in it. I need to tell you about the sound we heard at roughly the 200-meter mark, about 100 meters from the exit. It came from behind us, from deep in the mine. From somewhere far below, carried up through the shafts and drifts by the same acoustic properties that make caves such effective sound conduits. It was a sound like breathing, but not human breathing, not the breathing of any animal I've ever encountered. It was slow, each inhalation lasted maybe 6 or 7 seconds, and deep, with a resonance that suggested a chest cavity far larger than anything that should exist in a space that size. It was the sound of lungs, enormous lungs. Filling and emptying in the dark. We all heard it. No one spoke. We walked faster. The last 100 meters felt like a mile. The exit was a rectangle of gray daylight ahead of us. It was late afternoon, overcast, and I have never in my life been so grateful to see the sky. We came out of the mine at 4:47 p.m. September 10th. We had been underground for just over 10 hours. We stood outside in the sage and juniper, and no one spoke for maybe 2 full minutes. Just breathing the open air, feeling wind on our faces, seeing the sky. Then Rick said, "Nobody goes back in, I'm calling the company tonight." No one disagreed. Part 14, what came after Dale Morrow. His voice is quieter now, more guarded. Here's the part I wasn't going to talk about. I've given the account of what happened in the mine to 3 different people, 2 from the company, 1 independent investigator, and each time I've stopped at the exit. I've described coming out into the daylight and I've stopped. Because what happened after we left the mine is the part I can't file a report on. It's the part that doesn't fit any framework, not geological, not atmospheric, not psychological. And it's the part that made me stop going underground. We drove back to Ely that evening. 2 trucks, 90 minutes on gravel roads, then the highway. Normal drive. Nobody said much. We checked into a motel, same one we'd stayed at the night before. 2 rooms, Rick and Marcus in one, me, Tommy, and Ellen in the other. That night at approximately 2:15 a.m. I woke up. I don't know why, there was no sound, no disturbance. I simply went from sleep to full wakefulness in an instant, which is unusual for me. I'm normally a heavy sleeper. The room was dark. Tommy was asleep in the other bed. Ellen had the pull-out sofa. Everything was normal. Motel room. Highway sounds outside the window. Air conditioner humming, but I felt it. The same feeling from the junction at the 3rd level. The same feeling of presence, of proximity, of something aware of me attending to me from a location I couldn't identify. I lay in bed and I listened. And after maybe 30 seconds I heard it. Knocking, 2 knocks. A pause, 2 more, coming from inside the wall behind my headboard. I sat up. I put my hand against the wall. The wall was vibrating, not from the air conditioner, not from highway traffic. A deep, low vibration, the same frequency, the same character as what I had felt 800 feet underground, 6 hours earlier and 90 miles away. It lasted maybe a minute, then it stopped. The vibration ceased, the feeling of presence faded, and the room was just a room again. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning I asked the others. Rick said no, nothing unusual. Marcus said the same. Ellen hesitated, then said she thought she'd heard something in the wall but assumed it was plumbing. Tommy wouldn't look at me when I asked. He said he didn't hear anything, but he said it too quickly and he wouldn't meet my eyes. I didn't press. Documentary narrator. The company received Rick Padilla's report on September 12th. He recommended against re-entering the mine pending a full atmospheric assessment, citing deteriorating air quality on the lower levels and communication equipment unreliability. He did not mention the knocking, the footsteps, the voice, or the lights. He told Dale later that he didn't know how to include those elements in a professional report without undermining the legitimate safety concerns. The company sent an independent atmospheric survey team to the mine 3 weeks later. Their report noted that the air quality on the upper levels was within acceptable parameters. They did not descend below the 2nd level, citing the absence of adequate ventilation infrastructure. The southern passage on the 3rd level was noted in their report as inaccessible, airflow obstruction of unknown origin. They recommended additional ventilation work before any further exploration. No additional work has been conducted. The mine remains unsealed but unoccupied. The steel door at the main adit was left open. No one has offered an explanation for why it was not resecured. Part 15, the weight of it. Dale Morrow. His voice has changed. It's the voice of a man who has been carrying something for years and is setting it down, not because the weight has lessened, but because he's too tired to hold it anymore. People ask me what I think it was. They want an answer, a name, a category. Was it a gas hallucination? Was it infrasound? Was it a geological anomaly? Was it a knocker? Was it something else, something that lives down there in the places we're not supposed to go? I don't know. I know what my instruments recorded. I know what my ears heard. I know what I felt. And I know that those three sources of information do not align with any single explanation that I've been offered. If it was CO2-induced hallucination, then explain why four people with varying levels of exposure experienced the same auditory phenomena at the same times. Shared hallucination under CO2 influence is not a documented phenomenon. Individuals hallucinate individually. They don't hear the same knocks at the same moments from the same directions. If it was infrasound, explain the voice. Infrasound produces anxiety, visual disturbances, and physiological discomfort. It does not produce the sound of articulated speech emanating from a specific point in space. If it was echo and acoustic anomaly, explain the footsteps that maintained pace. Explain the air pressure pulse. Explain the simultaneous failure of four independent lighting systems. If it was a living thing, an animal, a person, explain how it moved through solid rock. Explain the knocking from inside the walls. Explain how it was in the mine and in a motel wall 90 miles away on the same night. I can't explain it. No one has explained it. The company's report doesn't mention it. Rick's report doesn't mention it. The only record that it happened at all is my equipment log, my personal notes, and the accounts of four other people, three of whom are willing to discuss it and one, Tommy, who has refused to speak about it since the day we left Ely. Tommy quit mining 2 months after the job. He works in construction now, above ground. I ran into him once at a gas station in Winnemucca maybe a year later. I asked him how he was doing. He said, "I still hear it sometimes, at night in the walls." He didn't say what it was. He didn't have to. Part 16, Final Report, Dale Morrow. I've been asked to go underground again, twice. Both times by reputable outfits, good money, standard jobs, the kind of work I did for 3 decades without thinking twice. Both times I said no. It's not that I'm afraid of the dark. I've worked in the dark my whole life. It's not that I'm afraid of confined spaces or bad air or collapse. I've faced all of those things and I've handled them. It's this: I'm no longer certain that the underground is empty. I used to believe that a mine was a hole in the ground. Rock, air, water, physics, geology, nothing more. I understood it. It was my world. I could read it like a language, the sounds, the smells, the pressure changes. It spoke to me and I understood what it said. I don't understand it anymore. Because something spoke to me in that mine, in the southern passage on the 3rd level, in a voice that was not rock settling, not water dripping, not air moving through a fissure. Something spoke, and I do not know what it said, and I do not know what it was, and I do not want to find out. I'll tell you what I think, and it's not a professional opinion. It's a feeling, and I don't trust feelings, but I don't have anything else left. I think there are places underground that are not meant to be entered. Not because they're structurally unsound or because the air is bad, but because they belong to something else. Something that was there before we started digging. Something that tolerates our presence in the upper levels, in the lit places, in the parts of the underground that we've mapped and named and claimed. But the deeper you go past the last survey marker, past the last brass pin, into the passages that have no names and no numbers, you enter a space that is not yours. And whatever lives in that space will let you know. First, it knocks. Then it follows. I filed my equipment logs. I filed my atmospheric readings. I answered every question the company asked. And then I submitted my resignation. My final report is this: there is something in that mine on the 3rd level in the southern passage. I do not know what it is. I do not know if it is dangerous. I know that it is real, that it is aware, and that it is not supposed to be there, or more accurately, that we are not supposed to be where it is. Close the mine, seal the door, and do not go back. Long pause. Ambient sound returns, but it's not the cave anymore. It's wind, open air, distance, the hum of a highway far away. Documentary narrator. Dale Morrow's equipment logs from September 10, 2019 remain on file with Ridgeline Associates. The anomalous readings, the air pressure pulse, the oxygen and CO2 fluctuation, the airflow reversal, have not been independently analyzed. The company that commissioned the survey has not responded to inquiries about the status of the mine. Rick Padilla continues to work as a mining surveyor. He has declined to comment on the events described in this account, except to confirm that his team experienced unexplained atmospheric and acoustic phenomena during the survey. Ellen Cho has referenced the survey obliquely in a paper on anomalous infrasound in enclosed geological formations, published in 2021. The paper does not describe the events of September 10th. It concludes with a recommendation for further research into the psychoacoustic effects of unventilated subterranean environments. Marcus Webb left the mining industry in 2020. Tommy Garza could not be reached. The mine in the Shell Creek Range remains open. The steel door at the main adit has not been resecured. The southern passage on the third level has not been resurveyed. No one has gone back. The score fades. The ambient sound fades. Silence, the kind of silence that only exists underground. 2 knocks. Silence. End.